The desert does not forgive weakness. It never has. Fort Brennan sits in the flat, sun-hammered stretch of southern Arizona where the ground bakes to the color of old bone and the air smells of dust and gun oil from sunrise to sunset. In August, the heat is not just temperature. It is pressure. It sits on your chest. It slows your thinking. It separates the people who have learned to function through discomfort from the people who have not. The outdoor qualification range at Fort Brennan runs east to west, 15 firing lanes laid in concrete sandbag rests bolted to the bench's target arrays stretching out to 800 meters and beyond. On a normal Tuesday afternoon in August, the range runs standard qualification drills. Personnel cycle through in groups. Instructors walk the line. Range safety officers watch angles. Everything has a protocol, a checklist, a place. Nothing about the woman sitting in the shade of the equipment shed had a place. She was 29 years old, though nothing about her suggested youth in any soft or ordinary sense. She was lean in the way that comes from years of carrying weight over difficult ground, not from a gym. Her face was angular, weathered slightly beyond her years, with a stillness to it that most people never develop at any age. Her uniform was standard military issue, faded from washing rather than wear the fabric soft in the way that comes from hundreds of cycles through an institutional laundry. No rank insignia on her collar, no name tape above her breast pocket, no unit patch on her shoulder, no identifying marks of any kind except for the long sleeves she wore, despite the heat rolled down to her wrist, buttoned at the cuff. She sat cross-legged in the narrow band of shade cast by the equipment, shed her back straight without being rigid, and she cleaned a disassembled M110 semi-automatic sniper rifle with the kind of focused attention that turns a task into a form of meditation. The bolt carrier group moved through her fingers in small, deliberate circles, the cleaning cloth catching light as she worked. Her hands did not need to look at what they were doing. They had done this 10,000 times. The movements lived in her muscles, not in her mind. Harlan Greer had been running this range for 15 years. He was 62, built like a man who had spent decades outdoors, spine still straight, faced the color and texture of dry river clay. He had served 20 years before his rangemaster career began, had seen every category of shooter the American military could produce, and had long ago developed the particular kind of attention that comes from watching human beings handle weapons every day for a decade and a half. He noticed things, small things, the angle of a wrist, the rhythm of breathing, the way a person settled their weight before a shot. He was standing near the control tower when the group arrived. Admiral Wescott came through the range gate with 6 officers flanking him in crisp Navy uniforms, their brass catching the afternoon sun. Wescott was 58, broad through the shoulders, his chest carrying the weight of a career decorated at every level. He moved like a man who had not questioned his authority in a very long time, which in Greer's experience was either the mark of genuine competence or the mark of someone who had never been properly tested in a situation where rank meant nothing. The group crossed toward the firing line, voices carrying on the hot air. Some comment about afternoon briefings, something that made the junior officers laugh at a volume slightly too loud to be genuine. And then one of them noticed the woman in the shade. Lieutenant Callum Ashby was 32, lean and tanned, the kind of officer whose confidence read as intelligence until you watched him long enough to see the difference. He was Wescott's second in command on this visit, and he carried that position in every angle of his posture. He stopped walking, said something. The laughter shifted, register became something sharper. Wescott turned. Greer watched from 40 feet away. He told himself he was watching because it was his job to watch the range. He told himself that for about 15 seconds. Then he stopped lying to himself and admitted he was watching because something about the woman had caught his attention the moment she walked through his gate 2 hours ago, and he had not been able to identify exactly what it was until right now, watching the way she sat perfectly still while 6 people approached her and realizing that she had heard them coming long before any of them spoke. Ashby stopped a few feet from her workspace. His voice carried a practiced ease that men like him developed for talking down to people they had already decided were beneath them. She didn't look up. Her hands kept moving, cloth in small circles across the bolt carrier. The same rhythm, the same pressure, as if the 6 people standing in her peripheral vision were no more notable than a change in wind direction. Wescott stepped closer. His shadow fell across the cleaning cloth and the carefully arranged components laid out on the foam pad beside her knee. Still, she didn't look up. Not from rudeness. Greer had seen rudeness enough to recognize it. This was something else. This was a woman who had decided at some point long before this afternoon that the moment she looked up, she would be giving something away, and she was choosing precisely when to give it. When she finally raised her head, it was not because she was forced to. It was because she had finished the movement she was working on, and had decided the time was right. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of deep water under a storm sky, and they met Wescott's stare without flinching, without challenge, without any readable emotion at all. Just contact. Clear and steady, and entirely without performance. "No rank to report, sir," she said. Her voice was quiet, the kind of voice that does not rise to bait because it has no need to prove its own volume. "I'm here to shoot." Ashby laughed first. It was the kind of laugh that needs an audience, and the audience responded on cue. One of the junior officers said something about the recoil on the MR-110 being rough on people who didn't know what they were doing. Another suggested they offered a spot for her. The words were designed to land, to sting, to produce a reaction. They landed on her like rain on stone. Greer found himself taking 3 steps forward before he consciously decided to move. He stopped himself, looked at his own boots on the concrete, made himself stay where he was. Because he had noticed something in the preceding 30 seconds that he needed to think about carefully before he did anything at all. Her breathing, 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out. The pattern so embedded in her body that she was running it even now, even while 6 people stood over her, making the kind of comments designed to strip a person down. Box breathing, combat breathing, the kind drilled into you at a specific level of training, in specific programs, in places that do not appear on organizational charts. Greer had seen it in exactly 2 contexts in his entire career. Both of those contexts were classified above his clearance level. He looked at her hands again, the grip she had maintained on that bolt carrier before she set it down. Index and middle finger positioned precisely where you needed them for a speed reassembly in zero-light conditions. The economy of movement in every gesture, nothing wasted, nothing performed, everything calibrated to function rather than appearance. His heart had started beating faster without his permission. Wescott was speaking now in the voice of a man running out of patience while still performing patience. The woman listened without expression, then stood. She rose from cross-legged to fully upright in a single fluid motion, without using her hands, the kind of movement that requires both significant core strength and the habitual practice of getting up quickly from positions where your hands need to remain free. She picked up the rifle, already reassembled. The check she ran on the chamber took under a second, a visual sweep so fast it would have looked like nothing to anyone who didn't know what to look for. Then she walked toward the firing line. Wescott followed, flanked by his officers. Greer moved to a position where he had a clear angle on lane 7. She settled into the bench, left hand under the forestock, right hand on the grip, body squared behind the weapon. Her cheekbone found the stock with the unconscious precision of a musician finding the neck of an instrument they have played for years. She made one adjustment to the rear sandbag, a shift of perhaps 3 millimeters. Then she went still. Greer pulled the spotting scope to his eye. The target at 800 meters was a standard military silhouette, black on white, concentric scoring rings. Ashby was still talking, something about lucky breaks and favorable conditions. One of the junior officers had started timing on his watch, which meant someone had made a bet. The atmosphere had the quality of a crowd that has decided the outcome already and is only staying to confirm it. She breathed 3 cycles each one, drawing her body toward that specific point of stillness that existed between exhale and the next inhale, the narrow window where the human body is at its most quiet. Her finger moved on the 4th. The first shot broke clean. The rifle moved against her shoulder, and she absorbed it without pulling her cheek from the stock, without blinking, already working the bolt before the brass finished ejecting. She chambered the next round. Settled. Second shot. Third. Fourth. Fifth. Total elapsed time from the first shot to the 5th 18 seconds. Greer already knew what the target would show before the camera feed pulled it up on the monitor. He looked anyway. He needed to see it confirmed. 5 holes in the center ring of the silhouette, so tightly grouped they almost overlapped. Every single one a perfect strike. The monitor displayed the automated scoring in green numerals. 5 shots, 5 tens, perfect score, 800 meters, 18 seconds. The range went quiet in the specific way that ranges go quiet when something has happened that people do not have a framework to process. No one spoke for a moment. Then Wescott told someone to check the rangefinder calibration. Then he told someone else to inspect the rifle for unauthorized modifications. Ashby did the inspection himself, working through the components with the focused energy of a man who needs to find something wrong and keeps not finding it. He set the rifle down harder than necessary when he finished. None of it changed the numbers on the screen. Greer lowered the spotting scope. His hands were not entirely steady. He was still standing there, still looking at lane 7, when he noticed something he almost missed. It was small, Ashby had stepped away from the rifle inspection and moved toward the other officers, and someone had said something that made him reach instinctively for his left pocket, where the outline of his phone was visible through the fabric. His fingers touched it. He stopped, did not take it out. But his face, for just one fraction of a second before the practiced expression reassembled itself, showed something that had nothing to do with the competition on the firing line. Not anger, not embarrassment, something closer to dread. It was gone so fast, Greer almost believed he had imagined it. He did not believe he had imagined it. Oh, did I bad it? Wescott was standing near the bench now, with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the woman the way a man studies a problem he cannot solve with the tools he has. His voice had lost its earlier edge. Something else had replaced it. Not respect exactly, more like the beginning of a recalibration that he had not anticipated needing to make. I want you at the qualification range tomorrow morning, he said. 800, different distance, different conditions. Official testing protocol. He paused. If you're as good as this one string suggests, prove it under formal observation. If you fail, you're off my range. Clear. She had been reassembling the rifle again, as he spoke, each component returning to its place in the same sequence, the same speed. She paused, bolt carrier halfway seated. Clear, sir, she said. She finished the reassembly, closed the case, stood, and walked toward the gate without looking at any of them. Greer watched her go. He watched the way she moved through the afternoon heat, unhurried, the rifle case carried at her side with the balance of someone accustomed to its weight. He watched until she passed through the gate and was gone. Then he pulled his radio from his belt, switched to the encrypted command channel, and stepped away from everyone within earshot. Control, this is Range Master Greer. I need to flag something off the record. The response crackled back within seconds. Go ahead, Greer. He had planned what he was going to say. He found standing there with the late afternoon sun flat and merciless on the back of his neck that the words required more effort than he had anticipated. Shooter at lane 7 today, female. No visible rank or unit. ED 510s at 800 meters. 18 seconds. Standard gear confirmed, clean inspection. He stopped. I need you to run a quiet check, because if she's who I think she is, we have a situation developing that nobody on this base is prepared for. A pause, then send the lane number and timestamp. We'll look into it. He sent it, lowered the radio. Behind him, the range was resuming its normal rhythms. Personnel cycling through drills, instructors walking the line. The range looked identical to how it had looked 3 hours ago. That was the thing about institutions. They absorbed the extraordinary and kept moving indifferent to the weight of what had just passed through them. He picked up one of the brass casings from lane 7, turned it over in his palm. Standard Lake City, nothing special, just a round that had gone exactly where it was supposed to go. He pocketed it and walked back toward the control tower. His mind was moving fast in a direction he did not want to follow to its destination. That evening, Greer drove to Mesa. Flynn Donahue had retired 3 years ago after 20 years in places that do not appear on maps. He lived in a single-story house on a quiet street, drove an old pickup truck, and kept a garden that he tended with the same patient, methodical attention he had once applied to things considerably more consequential. He was 55, gravel-voiced, with the kind of stillness that accumulates in people who have learned to wait without becoming passive. They sat on the back patio as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. No lights on. The sky above them went from copper to dark violet to black, slow and indifferent. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler ran in someone's yard. Greer told him everything. The way she sat in the shed, the hitch of recognition he couldn't name, the breathing, the grip, the 5 shots, the way her face had stayed flat and empty under pressure that would have cracked most people open. Donahue held his coffee mug and listened without interrupting. When Greer finished, Donahue was quiet for a long time. The sprinkler cut off down the street. Somewhere further away, a dog barked twice and stopped. If she's who you think she is, Donahue said finally, then Wescott just scheduled a public qualification test for the most dangerous sniper this country has produced in 20 years. And he did it because he thought she was nobody. That's what I'm afraid of. She won't fail the test, Harlan. I know. And when she doesn't fail it, Ashby's going to push harder. He's already embarrassed. Men like that, when they're embarrassed in front of the Admiral, they don't back down. They double down. He set his mug on the concrete beside his chair. What happens when they push someone like her is not the reaction they're expecting. You get something much larger than anyone in that crowd is ready to handle. Greer turned the empty mug in his hands. Then what do? We show up, Donahue said simply. He stood, moved toward the back door. I'll come with you in the morning. Greer drove back to Fort Brennan through the dark desert and did not sleep. At 11:45 that night, his phone rang. The voice was calm, professional, unhurried. Colonel Reed G2 calling from a line that appeared on no standard roster. Rangemaster Greer, we processed your inquiry from this afternoon. Yes, sir. The individual in question is cleared to be on your range. That is the extent of what I can share with you. Greer had prepared for this. Sir, with respect, I need to understand what I'm dealing with when that test happens tomorrow morning. You need to understand that she is cleared and that your job tomorrow morning is to run the qualification range according to standard protocol. That is all. A pause that carried weight. Do not run additional background checks. Do not flag her access. Do not discuss this conversation outside of secure channels. And if she shoots tomorrow, you let her shoot. Are we clear, Rangemaster? Clear, sir. The line went dead. Greer sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a long time. G2 did not call down to installation range masters. G2 operated at levels where qualification schedules were entirely invisible. For them to intervene at this level meant that whoever this woman was, she carried a significance that went considerably beyond anything that happened on a standard firing range. He opened his desk drawer, found the brass casing he had pocketed that afternoon, turned it over in the dark with his thumb. He thought about the tattoo. When she had been reassembling the rifle at Lane 7, her sleeve had ridden up briefly just an inch above the wrist, and he had caught a glimpse of ink on her forearm. Dark lines, geometric. He had not gotten a clear look. But in 15 years of this job, he had seen the tattoos that certain operators carried, the personal records kept on skin, the shorthand for things that could not be said out loud in any room with insufficient clearance. He had gotten enough. In Building 12 across the base, Sloane Merritt sat at the desk in the temporary quarters and read an email on a laptop she had stripped to factory settings and rebuilt from components purchased separately in 4 different cities. The screen cast the only light in the room. The sender field showed an encrypted alphanumeric string. She had entered the decryption key from memory. The message was brief. Wescott had accepted the setup. The qualification test was scheduled for 0800. Ashby was running personnel record searches and had hit the access wall built into her profile. Greer had contacted G2, which was expected and accounted for. The operation was proceeding to Phase 2. She was to move forward with controlled revelation, disclosing her identity only when forced and only in a manner that served the operational objective. Package delivery confirmed for 23:30 hours. The message closed with 2 words. Good luck. She ran a 3-pass wipe on the email, closed the laptop, and sat in the dark. Captain, it had been a long time since anyone had written that word in reference to her. 3 years precisely. 3 years since the decision had been made, somewhere far above her in the chain, that Captain Sloane Merritt of JSOC, Sniper Operations, was too compromised to return to active duty, her identity too burned, her continued existence too dangerous to the people who had arranged to have her killed in Kabul. They had not been unkind about it. They had simply pointed out that she was tactically more valuable as someone who no longer existed. She had agreed. Because she had understood lying in a military hospital with healing fractures in her left hand and a psychological evaluation form on the table beside her bed, that dead was the only cover worth having when the people hunting you believed they had already succeeded. 3 short knocks at the door, a pause, 2 more. She crossed to the door and opened it 3 inches. The man outside was in civilian clothes, mid-30s, expressionless in the professional way of someone trained to carry no information on their face. He placed a small, hard-sided case in her hands, nodded once, and walked away down the empty hallway without looking back. She closed the door, set the case on the desk, opened it. Inside, a phone. Pre-programmed, encrypted, untraceable, already powered on with a single contact loaded under the designation Tower 4. And a photograph. She picked it up. The image showed Admiral Wescott walking from the base housing area toward the parking structure. The timestamp in the lower corner was from 2 hours ago. Everything in the foreground was ordinary. In the background, half in shadow at the edge of the parking lot, where a single overhead light had burned out and not yet been replaced, sat a sedan. Dark and low profile. Tinted windows. A specific configuration of antenna placement on the rear deck. A specific way of parking backed into shadow, angled for maximum visibility of the building entrance while presenting the minimal visual profile to anyone watching from the windows above. She had seen that configuration before. Not that exact vehicle, but the methodology behind it was as distinctive as a fingerprint. The network had been doing it the same way for 16 years because they had never been caught and saw no reason to change. Consistency was their confidence. It was also their exposure. She set the photograph down. She rolled her left sleeve up to the elbow and held her forearm under the desk lamp. The tattoo ran from mid-forearm to just below the elbow. A scope reticle, the crosshairs rendered in precise, clean lines. Below it, in the small, disciplined numerals of someone marking something that mattered, 847. Below that, 2 words in capital letters. SPECTER. Below that, the dates 2018 to 2021. And at the base of it, small enough that you needed to be close to read it, the JSOC, insignia rendered in the same dark ink. 847. She traced the outline with one finger. Not all of them had been people who deserved what they received. She understood that clearly, and without the comfort of self-deception. Some had been in the wrong place. Some had been on the wrong side of someone else's calculation. But they had all been confirmed targets designated through a process designed to minimize exactly that kind of error, authorized at levels where the weight of those decisions was supposed to be felt by people with the experience to bear it. She had done her job, every time. 23 of those 847 names had been on a different list. A list she had built herself over years from fragments gathered in the margins of other work. 23 names connected through chains of varying length to a car bombing outside a house in Alexandria, Virginia, in the spring of 2008. Connected to a man who had spent 3 years building a documented case against a procurement fraud and intelligence network embedded at the highest levels of the defense apparatus, and who had been scheduled to brief the Secretary of Defense the following morning, and who had instead been carried out of the wreckage of his own vehicle in a bag. She had been 13 years old. She had watched the news footage on the television in the kitchen while her mother stood in the doorway with her hand pressed over her mouth, making no sound at all. She had known even then that it was not an accident. She had not had the vocabulary for what she knew, but she had known. Sloane rolled her sleeve down, buttoned the cuff. She tore the photograph into pieces too small to be reassembled and flushed them. Then she turned off the desk lamp and lay down on the bed with her hands behind her head, looking at the ceiling fan turning slowly in the dark. Tomorrow at 800 hours, Wescott would try to expose her as a fraud. Ashby would push hard. Men like Ashby pushed hardest when they were frightened, and she had frightened him today in ways he didn't yet have words for. He would push because pushing was all he had left when the other options had failed. Let him push. The ceiling fan turned. The desert outside was silent in the absolute way that deserts are silent at midnight, a silence so complete it has weight. She thought about a kitchen in Alexandria in the early morning before school. Her father at the stove with his back to her, the smell of coffee and toast, the sound of the radio turned low. He had a particular way of standing when he was thinking through a problem, slightly tilted forward on his left foot, one hand flat on the countertop, the other holding his coffee mug away from his body at an angle that had never made any particular sense and that she had never thought to ask about while she still could. She thought about that posture now in the dark with the fan turning and the desert silent outside. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow the sleeve would come up, the numbers would speak, and after that everything would accelerate in the direction she had been pointing it for 3 years. Sleep when it came was thin and restless, but it came. At 0800 hours the mission continued. Part 2. What the numbers mean. She rose at 5:50 before the desert had fully committed to morning. 4 miles on the base perimeter road in the gray pre-dawn, the air still carrying the night's comparative coolness. Then she showered, ate from the vending machine at the end of the hall with the methodical attention to caloric intake that had been habit for so long it required no conscious thought, and was at the equipment shed by 7:15, running through the rifle with the preparation sequence she always ran before a shoot. Not because she doubted the weapon, because the ritual of preparation had a function beyond the mechanical. It reminded her of what she was doing and why grounded the operational purpose in the physical act of readiness, connected the abstract to the concrete, in a way that clarified thinking and steadied everything that needed to be steady. At 7:58, she picked up the case and walked toward the qualification range. The memories had come during the pre-dawn run the way they came when her body was occupied and her mind was given space to move on its own. Not as continuous narrative, but as images precise and brief. The kitchen in Alexandria. October light through the window. Her father on the phone in the hallway, voice low, the particular stillness in his posture that she had learned to recognize as the stillness of a man who has heard something important and is deciding what to do about it. She had been 13. She had not known the vocabulary for what she was observing. Then the car, the news footage, her mother in the doorway. The basement room in Kabul came next the way it always came, not as a full memory, but as sensation. The cold that came up through the concrete floor regardless of the temperature outside. The single fluorescent tube that flickered at irregular intervals. The smell of the room, which was concrete and damp and something chemical underneath. The voice of the man who asked the same questions in the same order every session and seemed to believe that repetition alone would eventually produce the answers he wanted. It had not. 8 months of it had not. What she held on to was the last image in the sequence, the 15 minutes of silence when the footsteps above had moved away and not returned. The way her hands had worked at the restraints in the dark with methodical patience, no panic, no urgency that would cause errors. The specific sound the rebar made when the corroded bracket finally gave. The weight of it in her palm. 3 men. 12 miles of desert in the dark on bare feet. She had walked out of that, and she had not looked back. The qualification range sat isolated on Fort Brennan's eastern edge, built for formal testing and observation. Concrete firing positions, standardized target arrays running from 300 meters to 1,200 automated scoring cameras, covering every lane, recording equipment, logging angle, and environmental data, with the precision that makes performance undeniable in both directions. Wescott had arrived early. He stood with 4 officers at the observation position, his face carrying the expression of a man who has spent the night deciding how to feel about something and has arrived at a conclusion he intends to enforce. Ashby stood to his left with a clipboard prepared with considerable care, the pages crisp and tabbed the documentation of someone who has come with intent. Flynn Donahue was already there, standing at the back of the crowd that had gathered hands in the pockets of civilian clothes that fit him like a uniform anyway. He and Greer stood close enough to speak without being overheard. Word had traveled overnight. It always did on a base this size. The crowd was larger than any standard qualification warranted. 30 people pressed along the observation rail, trying to look casual, and all of them failing. They had come to see her fail. That was the shared assumption, giving the gathering its energy, the low electric charge of people who have decided the outcome and are waiting for confirmation. Sloane walked through the gate at 800 hours exactly. She moved through the crowd the way she moved through everything. Not aggressively, not performing indifference, simply following the most direct line to where she needed to be and treating the people between her and that point as a condition of the environment rather than a social situation. People stepped back without being asked, not from courtesy. Ashby moved to intercept her before she reached lane 3. Equipment inspection before you shoot. He held the clipboard with both hands. Regulations require any shooter using personal weapons to submit to pre-qualification inspection. Open the case. She set the case on the ground, flipped the latches, stepped back. Ashby went through it with the thoroughness of someone who had spent time that morning reviewing exactly what to look for. Serial numbers against manufacturer records. Scope mounts checked with a torque reference. Trigger pull measured with a gauge he had brought from the armory. Barrel crown examined with a flashlight and magnifier. He went through every component with the focused energy of a man who needs the search to find something and cannot make himself stop until it does. Everything passed. He closed the case and straightened. You're cleared to shoot. Today's test is at 1,000 meters. 3 attempts, 5 shots per attempt. Minimum score 45 out of 50 to qualify. All attempts are recorded. He paused. Conditions may be adjusted between attempts at the range safety officer's discretion. Greer's voice came from the control booth, flat and careful. Lieutenant Standard Protocol doesn't provide for mid-test condition changes. Section 7 of this qualification manual explicitly provides for range safety officer discretion, Ashby said without looking at Greer. I've reviewed it this morning. Wescott said nothing, nodded once. Greer said nothing further. Sloane picked up the case, walked to lane 3, and began her preparation. She took her time. The work deserved the attention it deserved regardless of who was watching. 1,000 meters in the August morning, the air not yet carrying the full thermal activity that the afternoon would produce, but already showing movement in the lower register, a light variable wind from the southwest between 6 and 9 miles per hour that shifted direction slightly every 40 seconds in the pattern she had been tracking for 20 minutes from the way the range flags moved. She made her adjustments to the scope with small, precise movements, not consulting any written reference, because the reference had lived in her for 6 years of doing this in conditions considerably less controlled than this one. She settled into position. The rifle found the rest. Her cheekbone found the stock. The crowd behind her was not silent, but it was quieter than before, the energy shifting from readiness for failure towards something that had not yet found its name. 5 shots, 31 seconds. Every variable accounted for, every wind shift read and compensated for in the fractional adjustments made between rounds. The scoring monitor took 4 seconds to display. 5 shots, 5 tens, 50 out of 50. First attempt. No one in the crowd made a sound. The silence was total for a moment, in the specific way that silences become total when something has happened that requires everyone present to revise a certainty they had already committed to publicly. Then Ashby spoke. Lane 5, before the second attempt. His voice was controlled, but only just. Lane 5 has full environmental exposure, no wind shadow. If her performance was legitimate, conditions won't matter. Greer's voice from the booth carried the flatness of a man choosing every word with precision. Lieutenant, moving a shooter between attempts during a formal qualification test is not within the standard. Lane 5, Wescott said quietly. Greer said nothing further. Sloane stood without comment, picked up the case, walked to Lane 5. Lane 5 sat at the western end of the line, fully exposed to the open ground southwest of the range. The flags downrange were moving harder here, consistent 9 to 11 miles per hour, with gusts that occasionally pushed past 12. The angle was different from Lane 3 by 8 degrees. The mirage effect off the ground between the 500 and 700 meter marks was already visible, the heat shimmer that bends light and misleads range estimation. She made new adjustments. Took longer this time, not from uncertainty, but because the conditions required more precise inputs, and imprecision at 1,000 meters was not a matter of degrees. It was the difference between a 10 and a miss. She settled. 5 shots, 38 seconds, everyone compensating correctly for the changed angle, the increased wind, the mirage in the middle distance. The monitor 5 shots, 5 tens. Second attempt, 100 out of 100 combined. The crowd did not find its noise again. It stayed in the silence of people who have witnessed something they cannot immediately categorize and are in the process of building the category from scratch. Ashby's clipboard hit the concrete. The sound it made was very loud in the stillness. He did not pick it up. Wescott moved away from the observation position toward Lane 5, walking slowly the way a man walks when he is thinking hard about every step. He stopped beside the bench where Sloane was sitting back from the rifle hands resting loose in her lap. "She's qualified," Wescott said mostly to himself. Then to her directly, "Who trained you?" She met his eyes. "Various instructors, sir. That is the only answer I am authorized to give." "That is not a satisfactory answer." "It is the accurate one." Ashby had recovered the clipboard. He was holding it in front of him more as an object to hold than a reference document. Something in his face was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with professional frustration. There was a strain underneath everything else, older and more serious, the particular strain of a person trying to maintain a structure that is being actively dismantled from below. She had been watching him since yesterday. She had been building the picture of him for 3 months. She knew when his phone had first received contact from the network. She knew how the demands had escalated. She knew the approximate contents of every communication because she had been inside the network's operational patterns long enough to map them with high accuracy. She also knew that if this operation was going to succeed, she needed him to stop being their instrument and start being something else. She looked at him steadily. 6 weeks, she said. The first photographs arrived 6 weeks ago. The clipboard hit the concrete again. This time, no one paid attention to the sound. Ashby's voice came out, misaligned, the tone wrong for the words. "You don't know what your wife Claire leaves St. Marcus Hospital at 5:30 on Mondays and Wednesdays. Your son Owen is in the 3rd grade at Brennan Elementary. He takes the bus home on Tuesdays and Thursdays." She held his eyes. "Industrial District South Perimeter. Warehouse behind the old logistics depot. 2 guards on the outside, 3 inside. Your family is in the back left corner. They were unharmed as of 2 hours ago." The color left Ashby's face visibly all at once, like something draining. Something changed in the quality of the silence around them. The crowd had been still before Bayern. Now it was the stillness of people who understand they are witnessing something that goes well beyond what they were told they were here to see. Wescott took a step forward, his voice stripped of performance. "What is this?" "Sir," Sloane said, "I need everyone without direct need to know to step back." He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and with a single gesture cleared the observation area. The crowd moved toward the gate in clusters, looking over their shoulders, uncertain whether they were being sent away from danger or toward it. What remained was Wescott, Ashby, Greer at the edge of the lane, and Donahue, who moved forward from where he had been standing without being invited, his presence carrying the quiet authority of someone who does not require permission to be where the work is happening. Donahue stopped 10 feet away. He looked at Wescott with the even steadiness of a man who has thought about what he is going to say and has chosen the simplest version. "Admiral," he said, "Operation Silent Dawn, 2019, the Korengal Valley." He paused. "You were leading a SEAL element, 11 personnel, including yourself, cut off from extraction by 30 armed fighters. 2 men down, limited ammunition, no viable withdrawal route. The extraction helicopter could not get in while the high ground was held." Another pause. "A single shooter operating from an elevation position across the valley eliminated all 30 fighters in 6 minutes. The farthest confirmed engagement was 1,200 meters. The element was extracted without further casualties." He stopped. "The shooter's identity was never entered into any accessible record. The operation is classified above the level of everyone currently standing on this range. Wescott had gone still in the particular way that men go still, when a memory they have carried privately for years is suddenly spoken aloud by someone else. His eyes had moved to Sloane and they stayed there. In the Korengal Valley in 2019, he had not known who was shooting. He had only known that the voice on the radio, calm as a weather report giving conditions at altitude, had told him to keep his people down for 90 seconds. Then the firing had started, precise, measured, continuous. And then everything on the high ground had gone silent, in his element had walked to the extraction point through quiet air. He had asked over the radio who he was speaking to. The voice had said, "Only it does not matter, you need to stay alive." He had spent 5 years wondering. "That was you," he said. "It was not a question. 5 years ago you asked me over the radio who I was." Sloane said, "I told you it didn't matter. You needed to stay alive." She looked at him without moving. "Same situation, Admiral. You need to stay alive. That is why I am here." Wescott's eyes went to her left forearm. She did not move to display it, but she let him see it, let him read what was written there in the ink that did not come off and was not meant to. 847, SPECTER, 2018 to 2021. The JSOC insignia at the base. "SPECTER," he said quietly. "We were told you died in Kabul." "They arranged it," she said. "The arrangement didn't hold." Ashby had not moved. He was standing with the clipboard pressed flat against his chest with both hands the way a person holds something when they need to feel the solidity of an object because everything around them has become unreliable. Sloane turned to him. She kept her voice level without accusation because accusation was not what this moment required, and she understood the difference between justice and cruelty. "They contacted you 6 weeks ago. Information requests at first. Low-stakes things that felt like they could be administrative. Scheduling data. Movement patterns. Then the escalation. They showed you proof that they had your family under surveillance. Then they showed you they had more than surveillance." She watched his face confirm everything she said without him speaking a single word. "They told you yesterday morning before I came to this range that there was a new variable they needed you to manage. They told you to make sure I failed publicly. They told you what would happen to Owen if you didn't." Ashby made a sound that was not words. "You did not go to anyone because you had no way to know who within this institution was connected to them and who was not," she continued. "You made the calculation that the only way to keep your family alive was to do what they asked and wait for the situation to change. That is not a character failure. That is a rational response to an impossible situation built by people who are professionals at building impossible situations." She paused. "But the situation has changed, Lieutenant. Right now, and you have a choice that you did not have yesterday." The clipboard fell for the last time. He made no move to recover it. "My family is really in that warehouse," he said. His voice had lost every layer of the man he had been presenting himself as for 32 years. What was underneath was just a person who was afraid. "Yes. Are they? Unharmed 2 hours ago. That remains true as long as the network believes you are still compliant." She checked her watch. "They have a standard protocol for moving assets when an operation becomes unstable. If they determine this situation has become unstable, which they may be assessing right now, they will move your family to a secondary location in approximately 36 minutes. After that point, reliable tracking ends." 36 minutes. The number sat in the air between all of them with the specific weight of a deadline that cannot be negotiated. Wescott's voice when it came was the voice of a man who has finished processing and moved directly to action. "Talk, all of it." She told him everything. She told him about her father, Brigadier General Edmund Merritt, and the 3 years he had spent building a documented case against a procurement fraud and intelligence leak network embedded at multiple levels of the defense apparatus. She told him about April 14th, 2008, and the car, and the briefing her father had scheduled with the Secretary of Defense that he never reached. She told him about the investigation closed 6 weeks later as mechanical failure despite engineering evidence that pointed in a specific and unambiguous direction. She told him about enlisting at 18 with the understanding that the only way to reach the people responsible was to become something they could not ignore or dismiss. About JSOC at 23. About the list she had built in 6 years from fragments gathered in the margins of operational work. 23 names out of 847. She told him about Kabul in 2021. The trap set for her specifically by people within the network who had finally identified that the operator under the call sign SPECTER was working her way through names connected to a 16-year-old assassination. The 8 months, the 15 minutes of silence, and the rebar, and the 12 miles of desert in the dark. She told him about 3 years as no one. working through the network's infrastructure from outside, mapping it, documenting it, waiting for the moment when they made a move significant enough to be used against them. That moment had come when the network identified that Admiral Garrett Wescott was scheduled to testify before a closed congressional hearing on procurement oversight, carrying 16 years of evidence he had never fully committed to paper until now. "They cannot allow you to testify," she said, "not because of what you know alone, because of what you corroborate when combined with documentation gathered through other channels." She paused. "The vehicle outside your residence last night carries the same network signature as the vehicle used to surveil my father in the weeks before he died. They are not in an active phase yet, but they are close. The hearing is 7 weeks away." Wescott stood very still throughout all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, the flags downrange still moving in the southwest wind, the range cameras still recording the August sun, still pressing down on everything without interest in what was being said beneath it. "Edmund Merritt was my partner," he said. "We had been working together for 2 years when he died. I knew it wasn't mechanical failure. I knew it within 72 hours of it happening." He stopped, looked at something past her left shoulder. "I had a family. I had a career. I told myself there was nothing I could do without more proof. I told myself I would find another way when the time was right. I told myself those things for 16 years. He looked back at her. "And while I was telling myself those things, you were in a basement in Kabul. You were walking 12 miles in the dark. You were carrying a list with my name on it as someone who needed to be protected, while I was the one who had stayed silent and let it get this far." "You are testifying now," Sloane said. "That is not a small thing. Only because you are here to make it possible. Then let's make sure it happens." She checked her watch. "I need authorization to conduct a hostage rescue operation on U.S. soil within base perimeter. Now, you have it. I need Greer pulling all the security camera footage from the industrial district for the past 90 days. The network's local coordinator is operating out of this installation at a senior level. They have been visible in that footage to someone who knows what to look for." She held his eyes. "And I need Lieutenant Ashby with me." Ashby straightened. "The network needs to believe he is still compliant for the next 30 minutes, she said. "If they lose contact with him simultaneously with a surveillance disruption at the warehouse, we risk triggering their contingency before we can reach the asset." She looked at Ashby directly. "You stay in the vehicle, engine running. When we bring your family out, you drive. That is your function, and it is not a secondary one." "I need to go in," he said. "I know. I know exactly who they are." The firmness in her voice was not unkind. It was the firmness of someone who needs him to understand something true in the next 10 seconds. "Your son has not seen your face since this started. When he comes through that door, the first face he sees needs to be yours. Waiting in that car for him is not the lesser choice, Lieutenant. It is the one that matters most." Ashby was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. Greer was already moving toward the control booth, pulling out his access credentials to begin the camera footage pull. Donahue had fallen in beside Sloane without being asked, the way men fall in, who recognize the shape of what is beginning and know their place within it. 4 others moved up from the back of the now empty range men Donahue had called in that morning. Without explanation, men who understood that Donahue calling without explanation meant you showed up and you asked questions later. 6 people, 2 vehicles, 32 minutes remaining. Wescott caught her arm as she turned toward the gate, not forcefully, just enough to pause her. "Before this goes further," he said, "your father told me something the night before he died. We had dinner at his house, the 2 of us going through documents. He walked me to my car. He stood in the driveway after I had the door open, and he said, 'If anything happens to me, find a way to tell Sloane she doesn't have to be a soldier. She can just be my daughter. Tell her that is enough.'" She looked at him. The morning around them was very bright and very still. "Tell me that after," she said quietly. "Right now I need 32 minutes." She turned and walked through the gate. Part 3, What Remains. The industrial district on the south perimeter of Fort Brennan was the oldest part of the installation, built in the early 1960s when the base had a different function and a different scale. The warehouses there were concrete block construction, low and wide, built for durability rather than efficiency. The kind of structures that outlast their original purpose by decades and accumulate new ones through proximity and the convenience of being overlooked. Most were used for legitimate logistics, secondary storage, equipment that cycled through infrequently enough that no one checked on it with regularity. The network had understood this about the district for years. That was the thing about people who operated at this level of institutional knowledge and patience. They did not improvise their infrastructure. They found the seams in existing systems and settled into them so gradually that by the time anyone thought to look, the occupation had the appearance of belonging. Sloane drove without rushing. Rushing produced errors. Errors at this stage cost more than time. She spoke while she drove, her voice even not looking at Ashby but aware of every shift in his posture, the way she was aware of everything in her immediate environment that carried information. "They will have a check-in protocol," she said. "Someone contacts you at a regular interval to confirm continued compliance." "What is the interval and the method?" Ashby's hands were on his knees. "Text message, encrypted app, every 2 hours during the day." He paused. "Last contact was at 7:40. She calculated. 9:40 would be the next expected contact. That gave them margin. Not comfortable margin, but workable. "When they contact you at 9:40, you respond normally. Whatever the established pattern is, one word or a brief confirmation. Nothing more." She glanced at him briefly. "If they deviate from the pattern and contact you early, you tell me immediately. Do not respond without my instruction." "Understood." In the back seat, Donahue sat with the settled stillness of a man who has learned that conserving energy before an operation is not passivity, but preparation. The 4 others in the second vehicle followed at a distance that maintained visual contact without creating a convoy profile. 27 minutes. She turned south off the main base road onto the secondary road, running along the back of the old logistics sector. The pavement here was older, cracked from too many Arizona summers, and the buildings sat back from the road behind chain-link fencing that was functional without being maintained. At the far end, where the road curved slightly north before terminating at a vehicle gate that was never used, a warehouse sat with 2 cars parked on its south side in a position that presented minimal profile to anyone passing on the main road. She parked 2 blocks back behind a maintenance shed at the edge of the fencing. The second vehicle pulled alongside. Everyone got out quietly. No doors slammed. She looked at Ashby. "Engine running, no lights. When we come through that door with your family, you pull forward to the end of the block. Not before." He got back in the driver's seat. His jaw was tight, but his hands on the wheel were steady enough. She noted that. It mattered. She briefed the others in 90 seconds. Clear objectives, clear constraints, clear individual functions. Men like this did not need more than that. Donahue took the west approach. 2 of the others covered the rear corners of the building, creating containment without engagement. The remaining 2 would follow Sloane through the primary entry point 30 seconds after she moved on the guards. 22 minutes. She moved. The approach was along the south face of the building, using the shadow cast by the roofline. The 2 guards were at the main door on the east face, positioned with line of sight to the access road. They were not inattentive. They were accustomed to a world in which no one came here who was not supposed to, and that accustomization had produced the particular kind of vigilance that is its own variety of blindness. She came around the south corner at a pace that covered ground quickly without being running. The first guard processed the visual of a figure approaching from an unexpected angle, and began the response sequence that training produces. He did not complete it. The second guard turned at the sound of the first one going down. He did not complete his sequence either. Tranquilizer rounds, non-lethal. Both men would wake in approximately 40 minutes with sore shoulders and a significant legal situation waiting for them. She was at the door in 4 seconds. The lockpick was in her left vest pocket, selected for this specific padlock model, which she had identified in week 3 of surveillance. 11 seconds to open it. She had practiced on an identical lock for 2 weeks. The door swung inward without noise. She had oiled the hinges during a nighttime approach 6 weeks ago. Small preparations, the kind that seem excessive until the moment when they are not. The interior was what she had mapped from exterior dimensions in a single walkthrough disguised as a utility inspection in week 5. A large open-floor shelving units along the north and west walls, a partition wall across the back third, creating an office and storage space. 3 of 8 fluorescent panels functioning, the others burned out and unreplaced. The smell of concrete and metal and long stale air. 3 men at a folding table in the center. Cards face down, the half attention of people waiting for something rather than actively engaged. Weapons slung, the slings loose in the way that comes from hours of sitting. A radio on the north shelving not transmitting. At the back left corner, partially obscured by the end of the shelving unit, Claire Ashby sat on the floor with her back against the wall and her son Owen asleep against her left arm. Her wrists were bound in front of her with plastic restraints. Her eyes were open. They had been open from the look of her face for most of a very long night. She saw Sloane come through the door. She did not make a sound. She pulled Owen slightly closer and stayed absolutely still. And in that moment, Sloane understood something about Claire Ashby that she filed away. This was a woman who even now, even after however many hours in this building, was making tactical decisions. She had assessed before reacting. That kind of self-command, under these circumstances, was not common. Sloane held up a closed fist toward her. Wait, Claire nodded once barely visible. 15 seconds from entry, all three men on the ground, flex-cuffed, disarmed. The two who had followed through the door handled the third man before he fully registered that the first two were no longer upright. No shots fired, no significant sound. The radio on the shelf continued its silence. Sloane crossed to Claire and pulled a blade from her kit, cutting the plastic restraints in a single clean motion. Claire's hands came forward and she pressed them briefly against her eyes, the gesture of someone reassembling themselves from the inside. Your husband is outside, Sloane said quietly, in a car at the end of the block. Can you walk? Yes. Claire's voice was steady, not unaffected. Steady in the way of someone who has decided to be functional and is executing that decision through sheer will. Owen stirred at the voices. He blinked, the slow, confused blinking of a child waking in an unfamiliar place, and looked up at Sloane with the direct, unguarded assessment that children bring to new faces before they learn to filter it. Is my dad outside? He said. Yes, Sloane said. He's been waiting for you. Owen stood without being asked, took his mother's hand and was ready to move. 8 years old, in a building he had been brought to by strangers and ready to move. She noted that too. She guided them to the door and handed them to one of the veterans who would bring them directly to the vehicle. She stood in the doorway and watched Claire and Owen cross the open ground in the morning sun, and she watched Callum Ashby come out of the driver's door before the car fully stopped, and she watched him reach his son, first dropping to one knee on the cracked asphalt, and she watched the three of them hold each other in the way of people who have come through something that redrew every boundary of what they understood about the fragility of ordinary life. She did not cross to them. This was not her moment, and she understood that clearly. Owen looked over his father's shoulder from across the distance and found her face. You're the one who got us out, he said. Your dad got you out, she said. I just drove. Owen considered this with the seriousness of a child who suspects a simplification and is deciding whether to accept it. He appeared to decide to accept it for now, with the implicit reservation of returning to it at a later time when he had more information. She turned back through the door toward the office at the rear of the building. The office occupied in the back right corner, separated from the main floor by a prefabricated partition with a door that fit imprecisely in its frame. She had identified this space in week 5. She had identified who used it in week 7. She had spent 4 more weeks confirming the identification before she allowed herself to be certain. She stood at the door for one breath, then she kicked it. It swung hard and bounced against the interior wall, and Colonel Vivian Rains looked up from the desk with the expression of a woman who has been expecting this visit for some time and has already decided how she's going to conduct herself when it arrives. She was 52, gray hair drawn tight at the back of her head, admitting nothing to informality. The insignia of a full colonel on her uniform, the uniform of the deputy commander of Fort Brennan, pressed and correct in a building that smelled of concrete and stale machinery. A coffee cup on the desk beside an open laptop showing a map overlay. She made no move to close it. Captain Merritt, she said. Her voice carried the even cadence of someone who has thought through this conversation and is executing the prepared version. I've been wondering how long it would take you. Stand up, hands where I can see them. She stood without haste, both hands placed flat on the desk, surface and then raised to shoulder height. The compliance was precise in the way that precision can itself be a form of resistance. The statement of someone who is not afraid of the procedure because they have already made their calculation about what follows it. Donahue appeared in the doorway behind Sloane. He stayed there reading the room. Sloane stepped forward until she was close enough that there was no performance possible in either direction. My father, she said, the car bomb, April 2008, who signed the order? Something moved through Rains's face. Not guilt, not shame. Something more complex, the expression of a person confronting a fact they have housed for a long time, in a part of themselves they do not normally visit. Edmund Merritt was the most capable officer I encountered in 30 years of service, Rains said. Her voice did not change register. His ability to trace structural corruption through institutional cover was genuinely remarkable. Precise and patient and thorough in ways that made him very difficult to work around. She paused. That was why the decision was made. Not because of what he already had, because of what he would inevitably find if he continued. Who signed the order? I co-signed it. I was the third signature. There were 2 names above mine. The room was very quiet. Sloane stood without moving. She had carried this question for 16 years. She had imagined 100 versions of this moment, and none of them had prepared her for the specific weight of hearing the answer, stated plainly without deflection, by a woman who had decided that the time for deflection had run out. She breathed, held it, released it slowly. You are going to testify, she said. Full disclosure. Every name, every account, every communication, every operational detail you have access to. And in exchange, Raines said, in exchange, you are the witness who broke this network, not simply another officer caught inside it. That distinction will be stated clearly and in writing to the prosecution and to the Congressional Committee. Sloane's voice was level. You will not walk away from this, Colonel. You will spend years in federal prison. But you will be the testimony that puts the two names above yours in front of a federal judge. That is something. Or you spend the same years in a cell at Leavenworth with no deal, no protection, no legacy, and the network closes over the space you occupied and continues without you. Your choice. Raines was quiet. Outside the partition, the sound of vehicles arriving at the warehouse perimeter, the military police response Wescott had initiated from the range. In the middle distance, a helicopter. The network will not stop operating because I testify, Raines said. I want that clearly understood. What I can give you will damage it significantly. It will not end it. I know, Sloane said. That is a problem for after. Right now, the problem is you. Raines looked at her for a long moment. The calculation visible the working of a very intelligent person who has reached the end of options that favor them and is choosing among what remains. All right, she said quietly. Donahue moved in from the doorway, turned Raines toward the wall, and applied the restraints with the practiced economy of someone who has done this many times. Raines did not resist. She had said what she intended to say. The morning was at its full height when they came out of the warehouse. Military police vehicles at the perimeter, a helicopter overhead, the base lockdown Wescott had initiated, visible in every direction, personnel moving with the purposeful urgency of an installation responding to something real. Wescott was there. He had come with the first police vehicle, which was not what she had instructed, but which she had anticipated. Men like Wescott did not remain at observation positions when the action moved elsewhere. He watched Raines come through the warehouse door. His face went through a sequence that was controlled, but not entirely contained. He had served beside this woman, sat in briefings with her, trusted her at the level that proximity and shared institution produce without being examined. Raines looked at him once as she was guided to the police vehicle. Neither of them spoke. Some recognitions are too large for whatever words are available in the moment. Ashby separated himself from his family and crossed the ground toward Sloane. He moved without the clipboard, without any of the architecture of authority he had worn since she first saw him. All of it gone now, leaving a man of 32 who had spent 6 weeks carrying something that had nearly broken him and had not broken him, and who was trying to find the right words for what that had required. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her. Then he went to one knee on the cracked asphalt in the open in front of everyone present. I have to say this, he said. His voice was not loud. I humiliated you. I doubted you at every point. I put obstacles in front of you at every step because they told me to and because I was afraid. He stopped. And while I was doing all of that, you were bringing my family home. While I was working against you, you were already working for them. He paused. I don't have any right to ask your forgiveness, but I'm asking. Sloane looked at him in silence. Long enough for the moment to be real. Stand up, Lieutenant. He didn't move. Stand up. The firmness in her voice was genuine but not cold. You were handed an impossible situation by people who have spent years constructing impossible situations for people exactly like you. You made the choices available to you. When a different choice became possible, you took it. She held his eyes. That is all I need from anyone. Stand up. He stood. His eyes were red at the edges. He put out his hand and she took it, and they shook once the handshake, carrying everything the gesture is capable of carrying when both people understand what it means. Your son is watching you, she said quietly. He turned. Owen was still on the hood of the car across the distance, watching with the seriousness of a child who is filing everything he sees away into a category labeled important to be understood later when he has more of the vocabulary for it. Ashby went back to his family. Wescott crossed the remaining ground and stood in front of her. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the woman who had walked through his range yesterday afternoon and sat in the shade of an equipment shed and waited for the sequence of events she had set in motion to arrive at the point it was pointing toward. Then he came to full attention, not a reflexive protocol. He stood at attention with the deliberateness of someone for whom this gesture is carrying the full weight of everything it was designed to carry, and he raised his hand to a salute. Captain Sloane Merritt, he said. His voice was clear enough to carry to the people nearby who had stopped what they were doing to watch. On behalf of the United States Navy, on behalf of every person you protected in 6 years of silence, on behalf of your father who was a better officer and a better man than the institution that took him from you deserved. He held the salute. Thank you. And Sloane returned it, precise, full count, then lowered it. Just doing my job, sir. No. He lowered his hand. The steadiness in his voice had cost him something to maintain, and the cost was visible. You did not just do your job. You carried a private war for 16 years. You gave up your name and your record and the life you were supposed to have in order to finish something your father started and the system abandoned. He paused. And I owe you an apology that no amount of words will make proportionate. I knew Edmund Merritt was murdered. I knew it within 3 days, and I stayed quiet and told myself it was pragmatism. His voice dropped slightly. It was not pragmatism. It was fear. And I have been living with the difference between those two things for 16 years. Sloane was quiet for a moment. You said this morning at the range that you want to tell me what he said the night before he died, she said. Tell me now. Wescott nodded. The night before he died, we had dinner at his house. He walked me to my car. He stood in the driveway after I had the door open, and he said, if anything happens to me, find a way to tell Sloane she doesn't have to be a soldier. She can just be my daughter. Tell her that is enough. The morning sun was high and white, and the desert around Fort Brennan was flat and enormous and indifferent in the way that deserts are indifferent to everything that happens on their surface, storing nothing, reflecting everything back without judgment. Sloane stood very still. The things that moved through her in those seconds were not available to anyone observing from the outside. Her face did not change in any way that the personnel watching from 30 feet away could have described. But her eyes closed for a moment. One moment, a single breath held in the stillness, and in those few seconds, the 16 years compressed themselves into something that was not smaller, but was different in shape, something that had found a different relationship to the space it occupied inside her. When she opened her eyes, they were wet, not streaming, just wet the way eyes become when something long held finally reaches its end. Thank you for that, sir, she said. Her voice was even. Will you consider staying, he said. He meant it genuinely. The military needs what you are, people who cannot be bought, cannot be frightened, cannot be shaped into a version of themselves they wouldn't recognize. The military has people like me, she said. They need leadership that protects them from what happened to my father. She looked at him steadily. Your testimony will do that. Not just expose this network. Establish a precedent for what happens when the institution protects corruption instead of confronting it. He nodded slowly, extended his hand. She shook it. Then she turned and walked toward where Donahue was standing at the edge of the perimeter, and he fell in beside her without a word the way he had fallen in all morning. They walked away from the building, away from the vehicles and uniforms, and the machinery of consequence, into the comparative quiet of the South Perimeter Road. What's next? Donahue said after a moment. She considered him. Flynn Donahue, 55, 3 years, retired from a career spent doing precisely this kind of work and precisely the kind of silence it required. She had identified him as a necessary resource before she had ever approached Greer. She had known that if things proceeded to this point, she would need someone like him. What do you want to be next? She said. He made a sound that was the outline of a laugh. I've been growing tomatoes for 3 years, Harlan. I am a very good gardener. I'm also extremely bored. The work doesn't stop because this network took a significant hit, she said. There is infrastructure left. Names Reigns will give that lead to other names. Someone has to work through those carefully, systematically, and without anyone knowing they're doing it. That sounds like work for a ghost, he said. It sounds like work for two people who are already invisible, she said. I can't do this next phase with a burned identity. I need a different kind of cover. The kind that comes from someone who is visibly retired, visibly civilian, visibly done. Donahue was quiet. You're describing me. I'm describing what I need, she said. I'm asking whether you're interested. A long pause. The base spread around them, personnel moving with restored purpose, vehicles pulling back into their regular patterns, the installation reassembling itself around the disruption, the way a river reassembles around a stone, closing the surface, continuing forward. When do we start, he said. After I testify. After everything that needs to be on the record is on the record. And until then, she said, I am a woman in New Mexico with a small house and no particular history. He nodded once. They reached the fork in the road, one direction back toward the main base, the other toward the south gate vehicle lots. They stopped. Harlan's going to want to know you're all right, he said. Tell him I'll send the brass casing back. Donahue looked at her. A pause. Then the outline of a laugh, fuller this time. He turned toward the main base road and walked without looking back. She watched him go. Then she turned toward the south gate and walked into the morning that was still becoming itself, the sun overhead and the desert all around, and the sky above it so blue it had no gradient, just an unbroken, implacable blue from horizon to horizon, the kind of blue that has no memory and no agenda. and will be exactly this blue again tomorrow morning, whether anything of consequence happens below it or not. She had been 29 years old for most of her life, or so it felt. This morning, walking through the Arizona sun with the case in her hand and nothing left to conceal, she felt 29 for the first time. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling. She decided to carry it carefully the way you carry something that hasn't been in your hands before, until she understood its weight. 3 months later, the congressional hearing concluded its fourth and final day of testimony. The security camera footage that Greer pulled from the industrial district on the morning of the qualification test, produced after 2 weeks of analysis by the G2 team at Fort Brennan, 47 hours of documentary evidence, connecting Colonel Raines to 11 separate instances of network coordination are conducted on base property. That footage became Prosecution Exhibit 38 at the federal trial. Greer testified for 40 minutes about chain of custody. He was the only witness who required no preparation from the prosecution team. He told them what he had seen in order, without embellishment, and the jury found him credible without deliberation. Harlan Greer received a package at Fort Brennan's administrative office 11 days after the events at the range. Inside, packed in foam, was a single brass casing. Lake City Standard. No note. He held it in his palm for a moment, then placed it in the drawer alongside the first one. He locked the drawer and went back to running his range. He did not tell anyone about the package. Some things do not require explanation to the people who were not there. Colonel Vivian Raines received 38 years at Leavenworth after providing 47 hours of debriefing that produced names, account numbers, operational records, and the 2 co-signatories to the 2008 authorization that were entered into federal evidence as Prosecution Exhibit 114. The 2 names above hers were in custody within 3 weeks of the hearing. They had believed for 16 years that what they had done was fully buried. They had been wrong for 16 years, and the error had compounded with interest the way errors do when they are never confronted. 4 other colonels received sentences between 20 and 30 years. 15 additional officers faced courts-martial proceedings extending through the following year. The procurement fraud and intelligence leak network that had operated embedded in the American defense apparatus for 19 years had its organizational infrastructure dismantled to a depth that the lead federal prosecutor described in a statement that was carefully worded and still managed to convey genuine astonishment as the most significant institutional corruption prosecution in a generation. Lieutenant Callum Ashby was cleared of all charges. The determination of coercion under duress, supported by extensive documentation, and the testimony of both Admiral Wescott and a classified witness whose name appeared in the court record only as a designation. He returned to active duty 6 months later. He established an informal ethics support program for junior officers facing external pressure, working with a military chaplain and a legal assistance officer out of a small conference room at Fort Brennan on Tuesday evenings. It was not officially funded. By the end of its first year, it had run 62 sessions, and the junior officers who attended did not talk about it publicly, but they remembered it. Admiral Garrett Wescott testified for 7 hours before the closed congressional committee, delivering a case that he and Brigadier General Edmund Merritt had begun constructing together in 2006, and that Wescott had continued building in private for 16 years, maintaining the evidence with the patient private conscientiousness of a man who could not bring himself to commit fully and could not bring himself to destroy what they had built. He retired with full honors 6 months after the hearing. He established with the first meaningful act of his retirement the Edmund Merritt Foundation Scholarship, funded in part by a congressional appropriation that passed without opposition, a rare and quiet acknowledgement that something had gone very wrong for a very long time and something was now imperfectly and incompletely being made more right. Sloane Merritt formally retired from military service on a Tuesday morning in November in a processing office at a Virginia installation at a desk staffed by a specialist who thanked her for her service without knowing the specific dimensions of what that service had comprised. She declined the Medal of Honor that had been recommended by 3 separate officers, her refusal stated in writing in a single-sentence award to someone still in the fight who can use it. She accepted the promotion to major, which was entered into a record that remained classified at a level above most of the people who would ever have reason to look for it. The house in Albuquerque was single-story stucco construction. The exterior the color of the surrounding desert because the surrounding desert was where the materials had come from the pallet, continuous with the landscape in a way that made the structure appear from the road to have grown there rather than been built. A small porch on the east side caught the morning sun. A saguaro cactus stood at the property's edge, old enough to have arms indifferent to everything as saguaros are. Sloane had been there for 11 days. She sat on the porch in the early morning with coffee, watching the sun come over the eastern ridge, the light arriving the way it arrives in the desert, first a brightening of the sky's upper register, then a warming of the distant rock faces, then the slow flood of gold across the flat ground, moving toward her like something being slowly poured. She had watched this happen 9 mornings out of 11. The 10th, she had been on a call with a federal prosecutor that ran until nearly 6 in the morning. The 11th, she had slept through the alarm for the first time in years, waking at 8 in clear, warm sunlight already filling the porch, and she had not felt guilty about it. She was learning in increments small enough to be manageable what it was to be stationary, what it was to have the next thing she needed to do determined by her own choosing rather than by operational necessity. Coffee first, then the run or not the run if the heat was already building, then whatever the day decided to be. It was uncomfortable in the way that stillness is always uncomfortable for people trained to function in motion. She was working on that. She had been working on harder things for longer. The rifle case was in the closet, cleaned, maintained, ready. She did not take it out, and she did not avoid taking it out. It was simply there the way certain things are simply there in the life of a person who has been what she has been, present, without dominating, acknowledged without being centered. She had been sitting on the porch for 20 minutes when she went inside to refill her coffee and stood for a moment looking at the envelope on the desk. She had set it there 3 days ago, the morning it was delivered by a man in a plain sedan who had knocked once and left it in her hands without identification or explanation. She had looked at it, she had set it on the desk, she had gone back outside and sat on the porch and watched the sun finish rising. For 3 days she had walked past it, not avoiding it, giving herself space around it, the space that comes before decisions that cannot be undone, before you pick up something that changes the weight of everything you carry once it is in your hands. This morning she picked it up, inside a single photograph. Aerial imagery, high-resolution military satellite grade. A facility she did not immediately recognize, low structures on flat ground with a perimeter road and a secondary installation attached on the eastern side. In the lower left quadrant, circled in red marker, a figure in the middle distance between 2 buildings. The resolution was high enough to establish approximate height and build, not high enough to establish features. And below the photograph, a single sheet of paper handwritten in the clean block letters of someone trained to write in darkness and under duress, each letter even and certain. Tower 4 sends regards. One name remains. Sloane stood in the morning light of the kitchen with the photograph and the note and was still for a long time. She thought about what Wescott had told her. She thought about the kitchen in Alexandria and the October light through the window and the smell of coffee and toast and the radio turned low. She thought about what it would mean to be just his daughter, the version of herself that had existed before the Tuesday morning that ended it. She had buried that version at 13. She had understood in the months after the funeral that grieving the life that was no longer possible was a luxury she could not afford, because what was required was something other than that. What was required was something that could survive what was coming and do what needed doing and not stop until it was finished. She had become that thing, completely. And it had cost everything that things of that kind always cost. One name remains. She set the photograph and the note on the desk and looked at them for a moment. Then she opened the desk drawer and placed them inside face down and slid the drawer closed. She went to the closet, opened it, stood looking at the case for a long moment, the clean lines of it in the half-dark of the closet, the weight and the readiness of it. Then she turned away, went back to the kitchen, refilled her coffee, and returned to the porch. The sun was fully up. The desert was itself vast and honest and indifferent and magnificent in the way that things are magnificent when they are entirely themselves without apology or performance. The saguaro at the property's edge stood in light it had been standing in for a century. She sat down, held the mug in both hands, watched the morning hold itself still for a moment before the day began to move. The drawer in the desk was closed, not locked. There was a difference between those two things, and she understood it clearly. Closed meant she was here on this porch with coffee watching the desert be the desert. Not a soldier this morning, just a person in the early light who had earned the right to sit quietly for a while. Not locked meant that if Tower 4 had found the last name, and if that name moved, and if the mission her father had given his life to begin, and that she had given 16 years to continue required one final act to reach its proper end. Well, she knew how to wait. She had been waiting since she was 13 years old, and she had never yet run out of patience. The hawk was up early, turning on a thermal high above the flat ground southwest of the house, banking in slow circles with the precise economy of something that has mastered its particular form of motion so completely that the mastery is invisible. The effort gone, leaving only the result. It rose on the column of warm air, with its wings held steady and its eyes on everything below, patient and exact and entirely without hurry. She watched it for a long time. The porch was quiet. The desert was wide. The morning was just itself going about the business of becoming the day, indifferent and beautiful and full of the particular peace that comes after a long, hard thing reaches its end. The drawer was closed. The mission was not finished. It was resting. And when it was time to finish it, Death Angel would not miss. Not at 1,000 meters. Not ever.